I'd like to welcome you all here to the Institute for Policy Studies. This is our Mandate for Change election series, and we are talking today about the election and war and peace. This is our Tolstoy event for you today. So I'd like to introduce to you the panelists for today, though frankly they don't need any introduction. Next to me is Phyllis Bennis. She's a fellow here at the Institute for Policy Studies and also at the Transnational Institute. She writes a book every 15 minutes. It's hard to keep up with her on that. She's going to talk to us today about Middle East. And next to her, Selig Harrison, Director of the Asia Program at the Center for International Policy. You've probably read his pieces in Foreign Affairs and Foreign Policy. We're very happy to have him here. Published as well Korean Endgame, but he's also an experienced reporter and has covered basically the entire arc of crisis, running from the Middle East all the way over to Asia, and he's going to focus today on Iran. And then finally, over to my extreme left,
Always.
Sorry, Bill. Geographically speaking.
Unfortunately, nothing's that far left these days. But
Bill Hartung is a Director of Arms and Security Initiative at the New America Foundation, expert on military spending, the arms trade. He's going to take a look at Pentagon and Pentagon policy. They're each going to speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll have about a half an hour for questions and answers. Phyllis?
Well, thank you, John, and thank you all for coming. You know, I was a little worried that nobody was going to show up for this because after the economic meltdown of recent days, the idea of thinking about the war for some people seemed to be sort of a stretch. And so I thought I would just begin by linking the two, because I think there is a very clear link. On the one hand, what we're seeing around the world with the U.S. economic collapse, U.S. domination capacity is reduced, and the ability of the U.S. to control the world through economic means is reduced. What that leads to, unfortunately, is not a straight shot towards real multilateralism, but rather a straight shot towards more reliance on militarism. And indeed, we are seeing an escalation in overall militarism. U.S. arms sales this year spiked to $32 billion a year. That's more than double what it was just in 2005 when it was, quote, only $12 billion. And the militarization of foreign policy is escalating at a dramatic pace. We're seeing this in the U.S. response in Georgia, the U.S. response overall to Russia, the push around the expansion of NATO as the main force of U.S. diplomacy is being militarized through NATO. The creation of the anti-missile shield in Poland, the similar developments in the Czech Republic. And now, of course, we have the first U.S. base being created in the State of Israel, despite the years of billions of dollars of military aid and this so close military alliance between the U.S. and Israel. There's never been a U.S. base in Israel. Now there is, as of last week, when the U.S. provided Israel with a sort of Poland-style anti-missile shield in the middle of Israeli territory to be run initially by 150 mercenaries from the U.S. corporation that creates these things, but with 2 U.S. soldiers, which makes it officially a U.S. base with a flag, designed to be a message that anybody who attacks is attacking not just a U.S. friend, a U.S. ally, a U.S. partner, a U.S. surrogate, but attacking the U.S. directly. So with all of that going on, it's not, in one level, surprising to think that the headlines are no longer talking very much about the war in Iraq. The war, of course, continues. The violence continues at shocking levels. The occupation continues. And while the violence has dramatically reduced in the last 8 to 10 months, all of the factors except for the so-called U.S. surge, are factors that have reduced violence temporarily, but are not under the control of the United States, are not something the U.S. can ensure continues. For example, the ceasefire declared by Muqtada al-Sadr was one of the most important reasons for the reduction in violence. The U.S. has no control over that, and that's something that could be reversed in a minute if al-Sadr decided so. Another crucial reason was the creation of these so-called awakening councils, largely Sunni militias who were essentially bribed by the United States to stop fighting against the U.S. on behalf of the al-Qaeda-linked militias and instead to fight against the al-Qaeda-linked militias on behalf of the United States to the tune of $300 per month per person. That is a very dicey proposition, particularly right now, because it's been handed over to the Iraqi government, the Shia-led Iraqi government, with whom these Sunni-dominated new militias are a very dicey ally and an alliance that may collapse at any moment. So this reduction in violence is very much a temporary phenomenon. It's good. Obviously, I'm very glad that there is this reduction in violence, but I think we're reading today about 11 civilians killed yesterday in Mosul when a U.S. Special Operations Force attacked a house. 3 women, 2 children among the casualties. The U.S. occupation is very much a reality. On the economic side, we see the cost of that continuing occupation. In fiscal year 2008, just to give you a few of the figures, linking this back to the economy, there has been already $182 billion in the wars that Congress has authorized. That's for Iraq, Iran, little Freudian slip there, Iraq, maybe Iran, looking at Iran, but Iraq, Afghanistan, and a small amount for what they call base security. Now, those numbers come out to about a little more than 75% for Iraq. That's $653 billion. That, we should note, is $11 billion more than last year. Last year, the U.S. said, was the worst year of violence. This year is supposed to be the good year, right? This is the year where violence is down, and yet we're spending $11 billion a year more than last year. That comes out, for those of you who are as math-challenged as I am, somebody else did the math, it's $720 million a day. That's just for Iraq. Afghanistan, they've allocated $172 billion. That's about 20% of that war budget. 3% or $28 billion for the base security. This is for bases all around the world. There's more than 1,000 bases that the U.S. has created and is staffing around the world, the new version of U.S. empire based on these buildings. And a very crucial, only 1%, but 1% of these amounts to $5 billion. $5 billion this year that the Congressional Research Service can't find. They don't know where that money is. This isn't those stacks, bricks of cash that were sent off to Iraq and disappeared. This is just money in the federal budget, and they don't have a clue where it is. So the Iraq and Afghanistan war allocations are way up. In the midst of that, economic aid to those war-torn countries is way down. It was reduced by $1.4 billion a year. So the total this year, with that $653 billion to make war, is, guess how much? How many billion do you think they allocated for diplomacy and assistance to rebuild the country? Foreign aid to those countries. Any guesses? Come on, somebody guess. 7. Wrong. 4.5. 4.5 billion, that's it. 650 something in war, 4.5 to rebuild. It's shocking. Now, we're here to talk some about the elections and how the candidates come out on all of this. I found it very interesting for a number of reasons to watch the vice presidential debate. It was less amusing than I hoped. It was scarier than I wished. But it was very instructive in a number of ways, because I think it showed both the significant differences in how the two parties, the two candidates and their two surrogates, talk about these issues of war and peace, and at the same time, how similar their actual policies are and why we need an independent peace and justice movement to hold them to some of that rhetoric in the face of some of these policies. So the first one I'll talk about just very briefly on Israel-Palestine. This was one where the rhetoric was almost identical. The rhetoric was to see who could position him or herself as the best friend of Israel. No one spoke of the question of settlements, the question of international law, and certainly while they both talked about the failure of the Bush administration's policy, this was one where neither one actually tried to say, we have a different policy, we have a different approach. There was no daylight, not from Palin, not from Biden. Now, Palin, interestingly, this was the one place where she was willing to talk about the policies of the Bush administration. Generally, in that debate, as you all know, the word Bush was hardly mentioned. Biden said it a couple of times. Palin, he might as well not even exist. On the question of Israel-Palestine, she did mention the Bush administration's policies, but linked it to Condoleezza Rice, whose support figures in the polls are much higher than those of Bush. So they have very unclear differences between the candidates on Israel-Palestine. The language in general is somewhat different. Obama does, as we all know, have a history of a very even-handed approach to this issue. He has spoken at Palestinian rights events. He has had dinner with Edward Said, and that's a privilege that most people don't walk away from unmoved or unchallenged in a certain way. The questions remain, is he going to be prepared to hold Israel accountable for its violations, particularly around the settlement issue, which is the easiest one for the U.S.? That remains unclear. For McCain, the language is significantly more dangerous because he links the conflict in Israel-Palestine to the global war on terror. Hamas is the Palestinian version of al-Qaeda, the Palestinian version of the Taliban. There's no distinction in his mind between the elected Hamas government in Gaza, what was once also had some influence in the West Bank. As much as we may disagree with lots of things about Hamas, they were elected in what the Carter Center and others said was the most democratic election in that part of the world, which, given that it took place under military occupation, is no small feat. But that means that the rhetoric here is important. It's for that reason, I think, we were just talking about the statement last week from the former Prime Minister and current temporary Prime Minister in Israel, Ehud Olmert, who said all the things that any knowledgeable, non-ideological watcher of the region has known for years. It's nothing new and different or amazing, except when an Israeli Prime Minister says, we have to pull out of virtually all of the West Bank, we have to share Jerusalem, and we have to be prepared to get out of East Jerusalem, of Arab Jerusalem. This was unprecedented, and it was huge. Now, it wasn't huge in Israel because he no longer has the credibility of a flea, because he left his position just ahead of the people coming to arrest him. He hasn't been arrested yet, but he's likely to any day now, for a host of corruption allegations. And he waited until he was no longer prime minister to say it, telling the world that even I am too much of a coward to have said these things when I was in a position to make them happen. But it does show how the rhetoric matters, and that's where the distinction between the two candidates becomes slightly clear. Now, moving on to some of the other questions. On Iraq, Obama says he would end the war. McCain says he will win the war. Now, in fact, Obama's policies are not to end the occupation. He would keep up to 80,000 troops in Iraq indefinitely, but he would pull out about half of the troops that are there now. That's no small thing. That's very significant. If there are 70 or 75,000 fewer U.S. troops occupying Iraq, that means there's fewer troops killing and dying on a daily basis. And that's, of course, a good thing. It's not, however, ending the war, ending the occupation. And that's why we need an independent peace movement to keep that pressure on Iraq, to keep the pressure on Obama to say, you got elected because you said you were going to end the war. What you've done so far is not ending the war. The war is still going on. The occupation continues. So we have to hold his feet to the fire on that. For McCain, this notion of victory through the surge is a very, very dangerous reality. He apparently would keep all the troops that are in Iraq now in Iraq for an indefinite period, as Obama has been saying, as the Obama campaign has been saying. This is in light of the discussions going on between the U.S. and the Iraqi government about what would be the terms for maintaining a permanent occupation. So far, the Maliki government, under enormous pressure from its own population, have refused to give in on the critical question of immunity for U.S. troops. The U.S. is demanding that all U.S. troops have complete immunity for whatever they do to Iraqi civilians. And the Iraqi government is saying, not so quick. We're not so clear on letting you do that. And the big shift now is that if that fails, if they're not able to get that agreement by December 31st or close to December 31st, whoever has been elected, the understanding is that the U.S. and the Iraqis will have to take it back to the United Nations Security Council for at least a temporary extension of that mandate that expires on December 31st. Until about a month and a half ago, the assumption was the U.S. will get that in a minute. No one on the Security Council is going to say no to the Iraqi government requesting that kind of temporary extension. Right now, after the way the U.S. interacted with Russia in Georgia, there's widespread understanding at the UN that if the vote was held today, Russia would veto, China would either veto or abstain, and half a dozen countries on the Council would simply vote no. So the U.S. would fail. Then we would have a situation where the U.S. occupation is now illegal. And then what would happen? So that question remains a very critical one. Very briefly on Afghanistan, fewer differences between the candidates. In both cases, they call for escalating the war against Afghanistan. Now, and this is a very dangerous moment because many people in this country still have the belief, after not really paying much attention to Afghanistan in recent years, because most U.S. casualties until the last few months were happening in Iraq, not in Afghanistan. The U.S. has about 33,000 troops in Afghanistan. That's what, one-sixth or one-seventh the number that are in Iraq. So it just hasn't been on our radar as much as it has been on the radar of other countries. But the reality is the U.S. right now has complete carte blanche. The agreement with the Afghan government was what the Washington Post called a two-page note that outlines no accountability. Civilian casualties are up scandalously this year, largely because of the increased reliance on airstrikes, which are attacking civilians in enormous numbers. Last month, the 90 civilians that were killed in western Afghanistan. In July, the 47 killed at a wedding party in Helmand province. And as a result, not surprisingly, support for the Taliban is growing, not diminishing, because people see them as the ones who are the only ones capable of fighting against this terrible occupation that's killing civilians. NATO is split over this issue. A number of countries are trying to either pull out their troops or even tighten further the restrictions on what they can do. Last week, some of you probably heard about this. A British general admitted that the war in Afghanistan cannot be won and said that the U.S. and the Brits are going to have to talk to the Taliban, that there's going to have to be negotiations. 74% of the Afghan people tell pollsters they want negotiations with the Taliban. And at the end of the day, the British ambassador to Kabul says, we're going to have an acceptable dictator as the solution in Afghanistan because the foreign troops are part of the problem, not part of the solution. Obama would send more troops to Afghanistan. He would get them from Iraq. McCain would send more troops to Afghanistan. God knows where he would get them. He might pull them out of U.S. bases. He might pull them out of South Korea. He might pull them from Germany. We don't know. But both say they would send more troops. Pakistan, finally, what many are now saying is the front line of this so-called global war on terror. The U.S. has announced from the Bush administration, and both McCain and Obama have eagerly jumped on the bandwagon to say they would be willing to send troops, including ground troops, as the Bush administration did just a week or two ago, without the permission of the Pakistani government, despite the claim of the U.S. that they support this elected, democratic, pro-U.S. government in Islamabad. So we have a scenario throughout the region that is very, very dangerous. Overall, we see escalation on both sides, escalation everywhere except Iraq, insufficient withdrawal from Iraq on the side of Obama, escalation from McCain, but escalation from both in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, stasis in Israel-Palestine. Anyone who's looking to the Middle East as the sole reason to choose their candidate, I think, is making a mistake. There are huge differences between the candidates, but policy in the Middle East, unfortunately, is not one of them. And I think when we see that one candidate is calling for escalation of the global war on terror, the other is saying that he would support massive global interventionism in the gloss of under the gloss of multilateralism, it means we need an independent peace and justice movement once again. We're going to spend, no matter who gets elected, the next 4 years in the streets protesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Phyllis. Before we go to Selig Harrison, I forgot the one thing that a moderator is supposed to do, and that is tell you to turn off your cell phones. And now, as you do that, Selig Harrison.
Thanks very much. If we'd had this meeting 6 months ago, we would have defined the issue between Obama and McCain as whether we're going to bomb Iran or not, because McCain was talking openly about bombing Iran, and a famous appearance in which he sang to the tune of the Beach Boys, "Bomb, Bomb, Bomb Iran." He's backed off from that, which is very interesting. We could discuss why. And I don't think he's changed his spots, but he certainly was very careful in the last debate not to talk about military action against Iran. The focus now is on Obama as a naive guy who doesn't know that you just can't go talk to countries and legitimize their leaders. And so they got into this stuff about conditionality or no conditionality. I was in Tehran. I've been in Tehran 3 times in the last year, June of last year, February and June of this year. And in the June visit this year, I did a lot of talking with the people I met about the implications of Obama's election, since he has talked about negotiating with Iran. I was able to meet, I had 3 very good meetings this time. One of them was with the first Deputy Foreign Minister, Mr. Shekatar. I'm going to return to these names, so that's why I'm giving them to you in advance. Another with the Chairman of the Defense Subcommission of the Majlis, the Parliament, Mr. Bourgerdi, and the third with the editor of the leading hardline newspaper, Kayhan, who's Mr. Shariat Madari, who's generally regarded as a voice of the regime. When Kayhan comes out with something, it's usually taken very seriously. So what I thought I'd do is tell you a little bit about the climate there, about what negotiations would have to be about if they are to be interested in negotiations. The American debate is, should we insist on preconditions? Should we negotiate with Iran? And they're asking, should they negotiate with us, and if so, on what terms? And Americans go to Tehran. They want to talk about nuclear weapons. What the Iranians want to talk about is mainly 2 things. One of them is the U.S. covert action now going on in Iran to destabilize the regime, the Bush regime change policy, which is very much alive and well in the case of Iran, and Iraq. So I'm going to overlap a little bit with what we just heard about the way in which Iran and the U.S. See each other's roles in Iraq, because I think this is one of the areas where Mr. Obama hasn't really, and his advisors, haven't given any thought to what we would do. You read this piece in today's New York Times. It's all about force levels, and do we leave 80,000, or do we, what do they do? And so the basic political reality that Iran sees itself as having the right to be the major outside power in Iraq is something we haven't come to terms with. But I do think that the first most difficult issue, if Mr. Obama is elected, that he would have in being able to get negotiations with Iran going is the issue of covert action. At the present time, the CIA and in cooperation with some proxies, Mossad, your friends mean Mossad, and also the ISI in Pakistan, and U.S. Special Forces units, which I should note can operate without informing Congress that they're doing anything. They can go into Iran and carry out missions that are not even nominally cleared with Congress as CIA covert action is. We've got some major programs going on. Early last year, April 2007, it leaked. When you get the president, in order to initiate a covert action anywhere, has to inform Congress. It's a rather cloudy area what Congress can do, and they rarely do anything. But if they're upset enough, and the leaders who are consulted are upset enough, the House Intelligence Committee, the Senate Intelligence Committee can get into the act, try to stop or reshape a covert action that is going on. Well, when you go to the Hill, things begin to leak. So early last year, we learned that the President had asked for a finding for a major covert action program. There were no dollar signs at the time we were able to get hold of, but non-lethal. That meant a very big program of trying to get to banks all over the world and tell them that not to deal with Iran. All kinds of non-lethal covert action, and then by the U.S. itself, at the same time that we were carrying on lethal covert action through proxies by aiding the Baluch through the ISI in Pakistan, which is, of course, a Sunni ethnic minority movement in Shia Persian Iran, Baluch covert action against the government, Mossad as the proxy in the case of the Kurds, carrying on covert action to try to destabilize the Kurdish areas of Iran. Iran is not all Persian. It's about almost half. The numbers are not too clear. Non-Persian. And manipulating these ethnic minorities is what the covert action has been mainly all about. Now, we then learned recently that they went to Congress early this year and supplemented the previous covert action program with a new $400 million program, finding by the president, telling Congress we were going ahead with $400 million more. In which case, and this one said we'd have the right to respond with force. So we're in Iran in a big way with aid to ethnic insurgencies in Baluchistan and Kurdistan, and we have special forces units doing what they can to find out about their nuclear program and at the same time stir things up. It's a combination of a destabilization mission and a nuclear espionage mission. And the important thing that Cy Hirsch brought out in a recent New Yorker piece that talked about all of this was the fact that whereas the CIA the president has to go to Congress and tell them if he's going to go into a country with the CIA, special forces can do what they want without telling Congress in the name of counterterrorism. And so an awful lot can go under counterterrorism. One final dimension of this covert action is an organization called the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, which is a MEK, it's usually known as, which was is an opposition movement to the Islamic regime in Iran. It is basically, well, first of all, they supported Saddam in the Iran-Iraq war, and then when we arrived in Iraq, we inherited the encampments, 4,000 strong, of these MEK, anti-regime fighters. And so we decided to use them for espionage. So we've got these 4,000 guys. We sneak them in to find things out, in some cases to carry out missions against Iranian targets, use them as translators, and it's a very contentious issue with the Iranians. At an earlier stage, before we arrived in Iraq, the MEK, an MEK operative was able to shoot at the supreme leader in Iran, Mr. Ayatollah Khamenei, and he still has a wounded arm, a bad arm as a result of that. So the first point I want to make is that the covert action program is the main thing that the Iranians want to see a change in before they'll be very seriously interested in talking to us. They'll calculate what they can get out of any negotiation. So I'm not saying that, I'm certainly not saying Obama has to announce that he's stopping covert action. You don't do that. But he would certainly have to stop a lot of things, and the Iranians would have to know it before they really would be in a mood for negotiations. The second most important area that the Iranians will be watching to see whether they are interested in a modus vivendi with the United States through negotiations with Mr. Obama is how we behave in Iraq toward them, how we act in terms of our understanding of their interests in Iraq. And so I will talk a little bit about I could talk about some of the things I was told by Mr. Brewer-Jardy about the preconditions for talks at some length, all the kinds of things that they throw out as initial bargaining counters, things we would have to do, stop sanctions, stop covert action, release Iranian assets frozen in U.S. banks since the hostage crisis, resume sales of civilian aircraft, which are banned, to Iran. But I think that really the most important area I should focus on in limited time is Iraq, because I don't think anybody's paying attention to this, and I think it's really quite fundamental. And the main point that I see nobody paying any attention to, but I got some of it spelled out in a couple of pieces during the summer, International Herald Tribune, Newsweek International, and so forth, is that, which the first Deputy Foreign Minister stressed, is that Iran doesn't want U.S. air bases continuing in Iraq, where there are based airplanes with long-range aircraft capable of posing a threat to Iran. That's a very reasonable, understandable position to take. But they haven't said this very out loud very much. But Mr. Sheikh Hattar said to me very clearly, I asked him, do you think, well, first of all, they want to see a withdrawal timetable. I mean, their first concern is there should be a definite withdrawal terminal date for the withdrawal of all U.S. combat forces. So if 80,000, if that figure is sound, I hadn't really heard that figure before, then that's going to be quite of a gray area as to what is a combat force. I asked him, any American forces could remain. Mr. Sheikh Hattar said yes. Some could stay to help with training Iraqi forces if their goal is truly training. That's of course what Obama says he's for. But Iraq would not allow the continued operation of U.S. air bases that could make Iraq a platform for harming the security of Iran and other neighbors. Why should the United States operate air bases in Iraq? And he went on at some length about the fact that Iraq is very upset that we don't let them have a real air force, and that we want to control Iraqi airspace. And from the Iranian point of view, he said very frankly, why shouldn't they have a big air force of their own? They have the money to buy it, and they want our air force out of there, and Iraq's air force given the freedom to develop its own strength. So I said, well, isn't this a potential threat to you? And basically what he said is that no, because he didn't say this, but we are the dominant force in Iraq. And basically what the Iranians think is that through the Shiite majority, 62%, they will be the dominant force in Iraq unless we prevent that. And that brings me to the other thing that they want very much to see changed, and that is the policy you briefly alluded to about the so-called Sunni awakening. Now, this really amused me. You know, all this stuff about the surge is really so much nonsense. What we did was go in and hire 100,000 Sunnis at $300 a month. And in the rise of the Iranians, this was a deliberate attempt to divide and rule. We would get a Sunni card to play, Sunni forces to use against their Shiite-dominated government. And so that, and Peter Galbraith, in a very interesting piece in the latest issue of the New York Review of Books that I commend to you. I don't agree with all of it, but he makes a very good point, which is that the reason that the Maliki government is now ready for a timetable and wants us out, and went out of his way to say that exactly what Obama had said, 16 months, and to make it sound like an endorsement for Obama's position, a very strong position. And the reason why they are hanging so tough in these negotiations over the agreement that you referred to is precisely because they viewed the Sunni awakening as a directly anti-Iranian change in our policy. We first went in there, Paul Bremer didn't have a clue. Finally, we allowed elections to take place in 2005 in which the Iranian-backed groups won. And we did nothing to counter huge Iranian involvement in helping them. They are active in Iraq, no question about it, and they think they're entitled to be, both politically and by aiding militias. So, for a couple of years, when they had a government that they liked, they were not hostile to the future of the American presence in Iraq. But when we changed our position, and in 2006 we started this program of this Sunni awakening, and then we had the temerity to go tell the American people that the surge was succeeding without even talking about it. And today's Michael Gordon piece in the New York Times talks all about the future of our presence in Iraq and says nothing about this, and this is the biggest problem. What do we do with these 100,000 guys now? So we're trying to let some of them, telling the Shiite government to please hire these people. We want multi-ethnic armed forces and a multi-ethnic government in Iraq. This is absolutely so childish. I mean, for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Sunnis and Shias have been at each other's throats, and there's absolutely no chance of any Shiite-dominated government absorbing all these armed Sunnis in their armed forces. And so the U.S. is going to face a very difficult problem of what to do with these 100,000 guys we've hired. And if we don't, and if the Shiite government doesn't absorb them in the government's armed forces, what are these Sunnis going to do? So I think Obama hasn't, and his advisors, from what I know, haven't begun to think about this really. And yet this is really the crucial issue. The crucial issue in Iraq, and I'll then turn briefly to the nuclear weapons issue before concluding, is that Iran has historically been very much involved in Iraq. And I've done whole articles on the historical context of this. Here's a brief line from Richard Fry's standard work on the history of the Middle East. The separation of eastern and western Iran is evident, and throughout Iran's history, the western part of the land has been frequently more closely connected with the lowlands of Mesopotamia than with the rest of the plateau to the east of the central desert. So you had all kinds of cultural and other interaction. Up until 1639, this was kind of an area where there were no clear line drawn. 1639, the Turks come in, push out Iranian influence, draw a border in a treaty in 1639, after which you have Sunni-dominated governments under the Turks, Sunni-dominated governments under Saddam Hussein, and then comes along Mr. Bush, not even knowing the difference between Sunnis and Shias, as we've learned through many anecdotal examples, basically giving Iran a chance to reestablish its influence in Iraq. If we don't accept that influence and try to act as if this is now an American protectorate, even though we're taking our troops out, we're going to have lots of trouble with Iran in Iraq. Now, turning briefly to and Obama, as I say, hasn't gone anywhere near this issue, and in order to negotiate successfully with Iran, we're going to have to be moving in a direction, first through a timetable for withdrawal, and then on the question of the future of our air presence in Iraq, that they see as friendly to their right to be influential in Iraq. One word in conclusion. It doesn't take much time to deal with the nuclear issue, because there is no non-proliferation regime. Article 6 of the Non-Proliferation Treaty provided that in return for not developing nuclear weapons on the part of the non-nuclear states, the nuclear states would progressively wind down theirs. We have simply said, sorry, we're in charge of this world, and you guys, we're going to have our own double and triple and quadruple standards, and we're going to approach every country in terms of what we think is good for us, and still say that we have a non-proliferation regime. Well, fortunately, the one good thing I think that the Bush administration has done, and this is another ancillary subject, but it illustrates my point, is for reasons not having to do with what I just said, we've now recognized that India was really entitled to become a nuclear power, and we're not going to exclude relations with 1/5 of the human race because of this artificial NPT construct that no longer really exists. So Iran's going to have a nuclear program. It is entitled to, under Article 4 of the NPT. It is prepared to place its enrichment program. Well, first I should say, my assessment is that it is not at this point committed to a weapons program. It is, however, committed to having the option, by carrying its enrichment program right up to the end and carrying on all kinds of research that would enable it to have a weapons program should it decide to do so. And there's nothing we can do about that. The only thing we can do is what they're ready to do, because it's in their interest too, which is to have a consortium of European and other outside powers join with the Iranian government uranium enrichment enterprise and thus make that program more transparent. Because if you have Germans and French and all sorts of people involved in critical stages of the enrichment process, the outside world is going to know a lot about what they're really up to. And I think really that's all that can be done in the case of Iran. And I think many people are beginning to realize that we may have to live with an Iran which has the capability of making nuclear weapons. I have all kinds of ideas. I've written about in World Policy Journal and other places about Israel's position in all this. 200 bombs in the basement at least. And an undeclared nuclear program. And yet Iran is not supposed to have a nuclear capability to respond. But I do think that the nuclear issue is, we're never going to get to talking about it at all, I don't think, seriously, unless we first are willing to, unless Mr. Obama is willing, when he first gets into office, if he does, to confront the Pentagon, to confront the Special Forces people, and Rumsfeld built up into a huge state within a state kind of, and the agency and other allied intelligence agencies, wind down the covert action, start saying things that indicate acceptance of the Islamic Republic. These are the things that really count in terms of getting into a meaningful dialogue with Iran. Iraq is the next most important thing. I believe the U.S. can reach a modus vivendi with Iran. I never use the word grand bargain, which some people in your shop talk about all the time, because I think that's very unrealistic in terms of the many conflicts of interest and perception. But I do think Iran is very realistic, leadership is very realistic, until they start giving speeches about the Holocaust and so forth. And there is no reason in the world to pursue the McCain bomb Iran business. There's not a threat to the United States, maybe a threat to certain American interests, as perceived now, not by you and by me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sig. Ending on the note of confronting the Pentagon is a good transition to Bill Hartung, who spent much of the last 2 decades doing nothing but. Bill.
Well, as you can see, whenever I confront the Pentagon, their budget goes up. So perhaps I should stop confronting the Pentagon. There's a Seinfeld episode where George Costanza is trying to, as usual, meet women, and he said, well, maybe I should do the opposite. Whatever I think I should do the opposite. It's quite successful for a short period of time. So I'm thinking that's what I should do in terms of my policy prescriptions. I should egg them on, and then they'll say, Well, if that's what Hartung wants, we better scale it back. We were talking beforehand about the military-industrial complex, which I'm not going to get into for the most part in my remarks, but except to say it's a very good time to be Lockheed Martin. They're getting about $26 billion a year from the Pentagon. Many of these arms sales that Phyllis mentioned are Lockheed Martin systems, F-16s to Romania to Morocco. They finally got their deal with the Chileans on track. They're going to sell possibly $7 billion anti-missile defense system to the UAE. It doesn't work for us and it won't work for them, but it's good money if you can get it. And so, in some ways, the defense lobby hasn't been that visible in the Bush years because they've been getting everything they want, and many other people are in policymaking positions in the administration. We're in Obama administration to try to even carve a little bit off here, a little bit off there. They would come out of the woodwork. So it's just something to keep in mind. In terms of the positions of the two candidates on the military budget and on arms trade, which I want to talk about a little bit also, I would say the differences are important, but they're not nearly far enough apart for my liking. On military spending, even when he was campaigning in Iowa, which has a substantial peace movement, Obama said at one of those barbecue get-togethers, well, we might have to bump up the military budget from where it is now. And of course now we're spending more than was spent at any time since World War II, more than the height of Vietnam, more than the Korean War, adjusted for inflation. So that's quite a statement to say we have to bump it up from there. He also wants to add 92,000 troops, both Marines and Army. And his one of his advisors, Richard Danzig, who is talked about as maybe his defense secretary, gave a slightly lower number today than Phyllis had mentioned, but nonetheless has said, maybe 55,000 troops after the quote-unquote withdrawal. So no matter how you slice it, that goal of withdrawal of combat troops is going to leave a third to a half of what's there now. And so that will mean, as a result, you're not going to save that $12 billion a month that he talks about, because even if you slice it evenly, which you probably don't, there's probably support systems such that you cut the troops in half, you're still going to spend more than half the money. He's not going to get a lot out of that until there's a full withdrawal, if there is. Now, McCain, on the other hand, is simpler to kind of analyze because basically his policy seems to be whatever it takes. And he hasn't given numbers, which is not unusual in a campaign, to not actually reveal your numbers of what you're going to spend on different things. But he did say, when Jim Lehrer asked the question of, well, how are you going to adjust your policies to the fact that we're in this economic crisis and there's going to be $700 billion perhaps going to bail out the financial housing industries, he said, well, I'd consider a budget freeze on everything but Pentagon, veterans benefits, and entitlements. So once you get done whittling that away, it leaves about 25% of the budget, of which are things like investing in infrastructure, investing in the environment, unemployment benefits, many programs that are likely to have higher needs as the economy gets worse. Because you can't just say, oh, we're going to spend X amount on unemployment this year if there's another 5 million people out of work. You could, but I don't think politically it's going to happen. So McCain basically is exempting the military from any kind of fiscal discipline. He's talking about staying in Iraq potentially forever. One of the models that he's given is Korea. As long as our people are not being killed on a regular basis, we can have a significant presence in Iraq. And of course, he has scaled back his rhetoric about Iran, but it's clear that if the Obama position is we shouldn't be afraid to talk, the McCain position is we shouldn't be afraid to threaten. And I think that's where we may see some differences play out, is more in the tone and the process of how their respective foreign policies might be carried out. And it's interesting in this regard. Democratic candidates, when they have spoken about military spending, often have to feel that they have to one-up the Republicans. You had, of course, Kennedy in the missile gap. You had Al Gore bragging in debates about how he was going to spend $50 billion more in increases than Bush was, and Bush said something to the effect of, well, you know, if you want to waste money, that's up to you. You know, of course, Bush wasn't counting the cost of missile defense, so his presentation of his numbers was somewhat disingenuous. So, you know, Obama has talked about speaking without preconditions, and as was mentioned, it's a two-way street. Just because the U.S. says, you know, we'll talk about whatever you want to talk about, without some changes in existing policy, that may or may not happen. But even that position has drawn fire from McCain and his running mate, whose name I forget, because she's gotten so little attention. But in any case, I do think that'll have implications. The fact that Obama is at least open to the notion of negotiations in places where Bush either hasn't negotiated or did it far too late in his term. And then the one thing I would say, though, is that in addition to wanting to beef up troops in Afghanistan, Obama has kind of an expansive view of the war on terror. In an article he wrote for Foreign Affairs, he said, well, you know, we need to be prepared to fight from Djibouti to Kandahar. Now, he seems to know where Djibouti is, so this is an improvement. But nonetheless, the idea seems to be, you know, you draw back from Iraq, but you still have this kind of notion that having a global military presence is going to be a major help in fighting against terrorism. In terms of actual reform within the military budget, this is one area where McCain actually has a bit of a track record. You may have heard about this deal where Boeing lost a contract for refueling tankers to a European company. And the Democrats were pounding McCain about this, saying, well, look, he's giving away American jobs and so forth. First of all, there were going to be American jobs. They were going to build a plant in Alabama. So the Alabama representative said, oh, this is great for America. Folks from Washington State and Missouri, the Boeing people said, you know, we were selling out American jobs. But in any case, it was McCain who originally opened this up to competition because through the good offices of Ted Stevens, another Alaska politician of note, Boeing had gotten a rider inserted into a defense bill shortly after September 11th that said the Pentagon must lease at least 100 Boeing aircraft, civilian aircraft, turn them into aerial refueling tankers, then after 10 years, give them back to Boeing. And it was going to be about a $26 billion deal, not vetted by the Pentagon, not vetted by the Congress, just slipped in there after Stevens had raised about $24,000 in one night from Boeing executives. And McCain, this bothered him, and he went after it, and he got the email traffic, and it emerged that not only was this happening on that end, but that the person who was negotiating the contract for the Pentagon had already agreed to go to work for Boeing for big bucks, and also had gotten a job for her daughter and son-in-law, as I recall. So anyway, she's and one of the Boeing executives are doing prison time. McCain, you know, on this issue, did the right thing, but he's getting pounded by many Democrats because of their parochial ties to Boeing. So I don't expect him to cut weapon systems, but I think he would keep an eye on sort of war profiteering and padding the, you know, in a way he wants to make sure it all goes into killing power, not getting wasted on abuses. So depending how you feel about that, that could be a good or a bad thing. Now, Obama has, on the campaign trail, he's talked about, well, we'll have to look at some of these programs. We'll have to look at the F-22 combat aircraft. We might have to look at attack submarines. He doesn't want to commit himself, but he's talked about possibly having an independent panel to look at procurement that would give him some political cover if he decides to cut some systems. Unfortunately, since Mr. Danzig has been speaking on the campaign's behalf, a lot of things have been taken out of the mix. He made a statement recently about the importance of missile defenses in East and Central Europe. He said missile defense is a useful program. They would probably chop some money off the top, but it's $10 billion a year now. It's almost as much as the Iraq War.
Danzig said that?
Yes, he did, unfortunately. I think, as was referenced, if we want to see cuts or even cutting the rate of growth of military spending in an Obama administration, there's going to have to be some political pressure. Of course, it's going to be against the backdrop of this economic crisis, which means something's going to have to give. And so it'll be important for people who think that we should be investing in diplomacy, investing in some of the basic needs of our own society, from infrastructure to green jobs, to speak out, and so that the Pentagon doesn't get a free ride, as it has too often in the past. And then we come to my issue of, this is the only issue I actually know anything about, which is the international arms trade. And this $32 billion in sales in the most recent year does not bode well, needless to say. It's the highest level since the first year of the Clinton administration. When it was post the first Gulf War, and although the United States was talking about restricting arms sales to Asia and the Middle East, the Clinton administration was making arms deals at about $1 billion a month. Now, some of them were carryovers from George Herbert Walker Bush, and they were just closing the deal. But nonetheless, there's been a bipartisan problem of not really trying to curb arms sales, other than the Carter administration, which we could talk about if people are interested. So neither candidate has spoken about this being a troubling prospect of these ongoing large sales. And in addition, under Bush, any kind of multilateral effort to limit any kind of weapon has been brushed aside. So they haven't tried to ratify the Landmines Treaty. There's a new global ban on cluster bombs, which the Bush administration has not only been standing aside from, but had tried to undermine. There's kind of just the very beginnings of talks about could there be some sort of global arms trade treaty that would put more emphasis on curbing human rights abuses and keeping weapons out of areas of conflict. And the Bush position was they didn't even want the UN to talk about the possibility of studying it. And so, at least they're firm in their position. And so the other thing that's been happening is there's a lot more money available in subsidies for weapons exports. The Bush administration has created a whole new group of aid programs that have gotten very little discussion. Some of them are the train and equip assistance for Iraq and Afghanistan, and they're starting to buy substantial amounts of weaponry of all sorts. And then there's coalition support funds. Anybody that has sent a few hundred troops to Iraq gets some arms assistance. I don't know what happens after they leave. I guess they keep it for a while. And then there's been some other programs modeled on those, but global in scope, like Section 1206 of the program run by the Pentagon, which basically provides arms and training on a grant basis, and is now pushing about $250 billion, $750 million a year, which is not a lot by Pentagon standards, but the expectation is that it's going to grow. There's something called the Counterterrorism Fellowship Program, which is sort of a separate training program from the ones that are authorized by the State Department. There's the Commander's Emergency Response Program in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is basically walking around money for commanders. Now, we walk around with $20. They walk around with $4 billion. And it's kind of in parallel to some of the stuff that was mentioned about buying the Sunnis. It's less money, but it's got a similar purpose. In fact, the manual for this program, the field manual, is called Money as a Weapon System. And the idea is if you bang up somebody's house, peel off a few dollars, it gets kind of gruesome. If somebody loses a limb, there's an amount of money for that. If a member of your family gets killed, $2,500. All of this is being basically just handed out without any kind of oversight. And I think that's about it. And I may well have used up my time. So.